June 14th, 1981, a Sunday night in the small mill town of Dalebridge. The rain came down steady, not in torrents but in a cold, soaking way that blurred the streetlights and left the cobblestones slick. A faint smell of yeast still clung to the air near the old Grayson Brewery, even though its doors had been shuttered for years. People passed by without looking too closely. Everyone knew the building, but no one wanted to linger. That night at 8:47 p.m. George Marwick, his wife Helen, and their 11-year-old son Daniel were last seen driving away from their farmhouse on the southern road. Their truck headlights cut briefly through the mist and then vanished behind the hedgerows. A neighbor remembered hearing their dog barking long after the engine faded, sharp and restless in the distance. No one realized it would be the last sound connected to them for decades. When the sun came up, the Marwick house stood quiet. Beds unslept in, dishes untouched, the truck gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints in the wet soil except for the familiar tracks leading from the door to the driveway. Hours turned to days, days turned into weeks. And as each lead ran cold, the empty silence surrounding the old brewery on the edge of town began to feel heavier. Some said they saw candlelight flicker behind its broken windows, others swore they heard chains clinking deep in the cellar at night. Police dismissed it as imagination, but the unease spread like mildew on the brewery's damp stone walls. For 40 years, no one touched the rusted padlock on its basement door, not the police, not the curious, not even vandals. It simply sat there waiting. And when that lock finally gave way, long after the Marwick case had been declared unsolvable, what lay beyond the door would make everyone wonder if they had been looking in the wrong place all along. George Marwick was the kind of man who waved to everyone on the road, even strangers. At 42, with weathered hands and a broad smile, he carried the quiet confidence of someone who had worked hard all his life and believed the land would always give back if treated right. His wife Helen kept the farmhouse alive with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. She was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, who dropped off casseroles at neighbors' doors without being asked. Their son, Daniel, thin and restless at 11, loved nothing more than racing his bike down the gravel path and dreaming aloud about building treehou says big enough to live in. Together, they seemed as ordinary and sturdy as the old oak tree in their front yard. The Marwicks had lived on the edge of Dalebridge for almost a decade, raising chickens, tending a small orchard, and trying to stretch every dollar George earned from hauling freight, but they carried a dream that reached beyond their quiet routines. George wanted to breathe life back into the abandoned Grayson Brewery, a landmark from another century whose brick walls were crumbling under ivy and time. He would talk about it over Sunday suppers, about the sweet smell of malt that used to drift through the town, and how reviving it could give Dalebridge jobs again. Helen smiled at his stubbornness, even as she worried about the money. In the weeks before they vanished, small details hinted at something shifting. George stayed up later than usual, sitting by the kitchen window with the light off, nursing a mug of coffee long gone cold. He made phone calls in the barn where no one could overhear, and more than once Helen found him staring at the road as if expecting someone to come up the drive. Daniel, too young to understand, just noticed his father seemed distracted, slower to laugh at his jokes, quicker to hush him if he asked too many questions. Neighbors recalled George mentioning a deal that was finally coming together, a chance to get the brewery deed at last. One even remembered him saying half to himself, "If this goes through, we'll never have to worry again." No one asked what he meant. In Dalebridge, you didn't pry unless invited. Helen confided to her sister that she'd been having trouble sleeping, that she kept hearing footsteps on the gravel outside late at night. When she mentioned it to George, he brushed it off, probably just a fox nosing around the trash bins. Still, she kept the curtains drawn tighter than usual and started locking the doors earlier in the evening. To anyone passing by, the Marwick farm looked as peaceful as always. Daniel riding his bike in loops around the yard, Helen hanging clothes in the wind, George loading up crates in the back of his truck. But beneath the surface there was a current, something unspoken pressing in, a sense that the quiet life they had built was standing on the edge of a change none of them had asked for. 2 weeks before the Marwicks disappeared, small signs of unease began surfacing, too faint to sound an alarm but sharp enough that people later remembered them with a chill. George, who had always been open with his neighbors, grew guarded. He stopped lingering at the feed store for idle talk and no longer shared updates about his plans for the brewery. When a friend, Alan Price, asked him whether the deal he'd mentioned was going through, George gave a strange half-smile and said only, "Some doors are better left closed." Then he changed the subject. Helen, usually warm and quick to laugh, seemed distracted at church the following Sunday. She forgot to bring the pie she had promised for the community lunch, something she'd never done before. A neighbor, Mrs. Givens, recalled that Helen gripped her hand a little too tightly when saying goodbye, as though she wanted to speak but held herself back. Later that afternoon, Helen was seen walking along the lane toward the brewery gates, head down, coat pulled tight even though the air was mild. She stayed there for several minutes, staring through the rusted iron bars at the weed-choked yard beyond. Daniel, being only 11, didn't understand the shift but felt it. He told his schoolmate, Robbie Kent, that his dad had been meeting strange men in big cars by the crossroads at dusk. Robbie thought he was making it up, just another wild story to liven up the bus ride home. But he remembered it later when it was too late to ask any questions. There were other things, two little fragments people pieced together afterward. A set of muddy boot prints on the porch one morning, too large to be George's. A letter Helen burned in the kitchen stove before anyone else could read it, the edges curling black as she watched in silence. A phone call George took late one night that ended with him pacing the living room, muttering under his breath, "Not here, not now, we're not ready yet." Neighbors also noticed a blue sedan parked near the old brewery several evenings in a row. No one recognized the driver, a man who never left the car, only sat with the headlights off, smoking as the sky went dark. One farmer passing by swore he saw George standing at the gates talking to him, their voices low, their faces tense. When asked about it later, George denied ever meeting anyone there at all. The town of Dalebridge didn't thrive on gossip, but it had a memory for odd things. And in those days leading up to June 14th, something about the Marwick place felt wrong, as if the wind itself carried a warning. Helen started closing the shutters before dusk, double-checking the locks twice over. Daniel said he hated sleeping in his own room because sometimes, just before midnight, he swore he heard footsteps on the gravel outside and a voice calling his name, soft, almost playful. If the Marwicks sensed danger, they didn't share it aloud. But every small gesture, every glance over the shoulder, spoke of a family trying to live normally while something unseen pressed in from the edges. Looking back, it was as though the walls of their farmhouse had been holding its breath, waiting for the night it would all collapse. June 14th, a Sunday evening heavy with low clouds and drizzle, the kind of night when even familiar roads felt strange, at 8:30 p.m. George Marwick loaded 2 crates into the back of his truck. Helen followed behind him carrying a wrapped bundle, its contents hidden under a faded quilt. Daniel trailed them, still wearing his muddy sneakers from the afternoon, clutching his favorite baseball cap in one hand. They spoke little, and when they did, their voices were low, almost swallowed by the rain. A neighbor, David Clark, spotted their headlights as they turned off the lane and headed toward the southern road. He remembered it clearly because his dog barked at the truck, a deep, steady bark as if warning something unseen. Clark waved, but no one waved back. He thought nothing of it at the time, just another family trip into town, maybe to visit Helen's sister or pick up supplies before the stores closed. The last confirmed sighting came from a passing motorist, a nurse named Emily Rhodes who was driving home from a late shift. She saw the Marwick truck pulled to the side of Old Quarry Road around 8:45. George stood beside it in the rain, talking to someone in a dark sedan parked just ahead. The 2 vehicles were nose to tail, engines idling, beams cutting through the mist. Emily slowed as she passed, glimpsing George's tense posture, Helen sitting rigid in the passenger seat, and Daniel leaning forward between them. The sedan's driver never turned his face toward her. By 9:10, the rain grew heavier, washing away tracks on the muddy shoulders. No one remembers hearing the truck pass through the next intersection. No one saw them in town. No one saw them turn back. It was as if the Marwicks simply dissolved into the darkness between 1 mile marker and the next. When dawn came, their farmhouse looked untouched, almost staged. Breakfast dishes from the day before still sat by the sink. Daniel's bike lay tipped over near the porch, a baseball glove soaking in the grass where he'd dropped it. The dog barked at every passing car as if expecting them to return. Investigators searched Old Quarry Road that very morning. No tire ruts, no broken branches, no sign of an accident, just the endless hiss of rain on wet leaves and the echo of their own footsteps. The only odd detail came from Clark again. He swore he heard an engine start sometime after midnight, far off in the direction of the old brewery, but he couldn't say whose it was. He hadn't gone to check. No one did. The Marwick truck was never found that night. Not in the ditches, not along the river bends, not hidden down any farm track. It was as if the family had vanished between the beating of a raindrop and the next. And as the hours passed with no word, a quiet dread settled over Dalebridge, whispering that something far more deliberate than misfortune had taken hold of them. The search began at first light when Helen's sister phoned the sheriff after finding the farmhouse unlocked, cold, and still. By mid-morning, Sheriff Paul Whitaker had half the town out scouring the roads and hedgerows. Men with lanterns waded into the creek beds, their boots sucking at the mud. Volunteers combed through the fields in long lines, calling the Marwicks names as if sheer volume could bring them home. The truck was nowhere. Neither were fresh tracks or broken branches to show where it might have gone. The rain had done its work overnight, washing every sign clean. Officers brought in a state helicopter to sweep the valley, its rotor thudding over the town like a warning bell. From above, the winding lanes, stone fences, and patchwork fields all looked harmless, but on the ground, every shadow felt like it was hiding something. NG neighbors did what they could. Sarah Givens organized food for the search parties, while David Clark stayed up late stringing lanterns along the lane. Alan Price, George's closest friend, drove up and down Old Quarry Road for hours, stopping at every turnout to shine his flashlight into the undergrowth. He swore he could still hear the dog barking in his head, sharp, restless, as if calling its family back. Rumors rose almost as fast as the search. Some claimed they'd heard an argument at the crossroads the night before. Others swore they saw headlights near the brewery well past midnight. A few whispered about debts George might have owed or about strangers who'd been passing through town too often lately, always asking directions but never saying where they were headed. The police questioned everyone, even the passing nurse who'd seen the Marwick truck stopped on the roadside. Emily Rhodes told them exactly what she'd seen: George speaking to someone in a dark sedan, Helen stiff in her seat, Daniel craning his neck to look at her car. Her story sent search teams deeper into the woods along Old Quarry Road, where they hacked through brambles and waded into gullies looking for tire root. Cigarette butts, anything. They found nothing. As evening fell on that first day, the farmhouse filled with relatives clutching mugs of coffee gone cold. The sheriff stood by the window, watching headlights snake along the distant road, knowing every hour that passed made it less likely they'd find Answa. Quickly. Helen's sister cried softly at the kitchen table, staring at Daniel's abandoned baseball glove on the counter as if it were a message left behind. By nightfall, the town was holding its breath. The search teams returned muddy and exhausted, promising to start again at dawn. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but in Dalebridge, people understood when something was wrong beyond fixing. And in the silence that settled over the valley, it was already clear: the Marwicks had not simply lost their way. They had been taken by something deeper, something that could not be found by lantern light or dogs or men calling their names into the dark. Weeks turned into months and the Marwick case slipped from the front page to the back columns, then into silence. Sheriff Whittaker kept the files open on his desk, but every lead thinned out into nothing, every phone call ended with more questions than answers. By winter, even the state investigators had gone home, leaving behind only a stack of typed reports and the hollow promise to stay in touch. Dalebridge did what small towns always do when tragedy lingers too long. They folded it up, tucked it away, and went on pretending. The fields were planted again in spring. The school reopened after Christmas break with one desk empty, Daniel's books still sitting in his cubby. Folks waved at each other on Main Street, but conversations trailed off whenever the Marwick name came up. Still, there were things people noticed, though they didn't say them out loud. The brewery on the edge of town seemed to breathe at night. Passing drivers said they saw a dim light burning in an upstairs window, though the power had been cut for years. A deliveryman swore he heard the faint echo of machinery deep inside the walls, like the hum of a long-dead generator waking from sleep. Sheriff Whittaker dismissed it as stories born from grief, but he never once parked his cruiser near the brewery after sunset. One evening in early March, a drifter named Carl Dawson wandered into Dalebridge looking for work. He'd done odd jobs in nearby towns, nothing steady, just enough to keep gas in his pickup. Over drinks at the Rusted Nail Tavern, Carl mentioned he'd found shelter in the abandoned brewery. The regulars went quiet. Someone told him he'd best stay clear of that place, but Carl only laughed. "Doors locked tight," he said, "but I know a window upstairs you can pry open if you're not afraid of a little dust." 2 nights later, Carl Dawson was gone. His truck sat in the same spot outside the tavern where he'd left it, keys still in the ignition. No one admitted to hearing anything unusual, though old Tom Willis, who lived near the river, swore he saw a flashlight beam wavering inside the brewery just after midnight. The next morning, Sheriff Whittaker found Dawson's muddy footprints leading up to the building, but none leading out. For most of Dalebridge, it was easier to let the story die than to ask more questions. People told themselves Carl had moved on, just another restless man passing through, but Whittaker knew better. When he stood by the rusted door to the cellar, staring at the padlock that never seemed to rust enough to break, he felt something waiting. Not the weight of memory or fear, something alive, listening, patient as stone. By the summer of 1992, Dalebridge was sweltering under a heat wave. The river had shrunk to a sluggish trickle, the cornfields browned too soon and tempers ran short. Sheriff Whittaker, now with a hint of gray in his hair, still carried the Marwick file in the trunk of his cruiser. He didn't talk about it anymore, but the weight was there, pressing against him on long, sleepless nights. That July, a man named Frank Leland moved back into town. Frank had grown up in Dalebridge but left for Chicago years ago, chasing factory work. He returned with a limp, a duffel bag, and stories no one quite believed. Over a beer at the Rusted Nail, Frank mentioned the brewery without prompting. He said he'd gone by it on his first night back, just to see if the old legends still clung to the stone. "Funny thing," he said, eyes narrowing, "that padlock on the cellar door looks brand new." Whittaker didn't answer, he'd noticed it too. The lock should have been rusted solid after all these years, but every time he checked, it gleamed like it had just been set there, steel bright, uncorked. Oded out of place on a door warped with age. 2 weeks later, Frank disappeared. He told a waitress at the diner he was planning to prove the whole town wrong about the brewery, that he was going inside to show there was nothing there. That night, the power flickered across Dalebridge, just for a second, just long enough for people to glance up from their dinner tables and mutter "Abo." The heat straining the grid. The next morning, Whittaker found tire tracks leading toward the brewery. In the dust by the cellar door, the faint impression of boot soles dragging slightly, as if someone hesitated before going in. The padlock still hung there, unbroken, cold to the touch even in the morning sun. Frank's truck was discovered 3 miles away, abandoned on the edge of a soybean field, driver's door open, radio still humming static. People tried not to talk about it, but the air in Dalebridge shifted. The silence around the Marwick's disappearance and Carl Dawson's vanishing act could be explained away by time and distance. But Frank Leland had been one of their own. This wasn't a drifter no one claimed. This was someone who sat in their pews on Sunday, who'd eaten at their kitchen tables when he was a boy. Late that evening, Whittaker stood outside the brewery, sweat trickling down his back. The sun was dropping low, casting long shadows across the yard. He gripped his flashlight tighter and stared at that door, that perfect lock. Somewhere deep inside, he could swear he heard a faint thud, slow, steady. Almost like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Whittaker didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with the lights off, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, listening to the crickets outside. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Frank's truck door swinging open in the wind, heard that hollow thud echoing from beneath the brewery. By dawn, he'd made up his mind. He was going to open that cellar door, lock or no lock. Before he left, he stopped by the hardware store. Old Man Carter raised an eyebrow when the sheriff bought a bolt cutter. Planning on fixing something? He asked. Whittaker just grunted, paid cash, and walked out without another word. The brewery was silent when he pulled up. The grass along the drive was waist-high, swaying in the early morning breeze, and the building's windows glared dull in the sun. He circled to the back, past the rusted tanks and collapsed loading dock, until he came to the cellar door. That lock, clean, sharp-edged, untouched by rust, looked like it had been set there yesterday. Whittaker crouched, gripped the bolt cutter tight, and pressed the jaws against the steel. It was harder than it looked. He leaned his weight into it until the muscles in his arms burned. With a sharp crack, the lock snapped, dropping to the ground with an unnatural heaviness, like it was made of something denser than metal. The door creaked open a few inches on its own, as if something inside was breathing out after being sealed away too long. A wave of cool, damp air rolled up from the dark, smelling faintly of yeast, old wood, and something sweeter, like rotting fruit. "Frank." Whittaker called, his voice echoing down the narrow steps. No answer, only the sound of water dripping somewhere deep below. He clicked on his flashlight and descended. The steps were slick with moss, the walls slicker still, as if the stone itself had begun to sweat. At the bottom, the cellar opened into a wide room lined with empty barrels, their hoops rusted, their staves warped. In the center stood a single crate, its lid freshly pried open. Inside lay bottles capped in red wax, their labels curling but legible. Marwick Reserve, 1958. The sheriff reached for one, then froze. Behind him, somewhere in the darkness of the far corner, came a faint shuffle. A boot on stone. He turned the light, but there was nothing there, just rows of barrels and shadows. His hand tightened on the bottle, and for the first time in years, Whittaker felt the cold bite of fear. Then he heard it again, that slow, steady thud. Not from above, not from outside, but from beneath his feet, a heartbeat in the earth itself, growing louder with every passing second. Whittaker's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay quiet. The cellar was still except for that deep, rhythmic sound, too slow to be machinery, too deliberate to be just water pipes. He swept the flashlight across the far wall, past the barrels, past the old shelving, and froze when the beam caught a dark patch on the floor. It wasn't a stain, it was an opening, a narrow slit where the stonework had shifted, leaving just enough space for air to escape. And from that slit the sound was pulsing, steady and wet, like something alive was buried deep below. The sheriff crouched low, bottle still clutched in one hand, and pressed his ear close. The beat was stronger here, almost humming through the ground. Suddenly a sharp clink rang out behind him. He spun around, light jerking wildly, only to see another bottle, identical to the one in his hand, rolling slowly across the floor. It came to rest against his boot. "Frank," Whittaker whispered, though he already knew Frank wouldn't answer. From the shadows near the far corner, a voice called out, hoarse and raw, "Sheriff, don't go." Whittaker's throat went dry. "Frank, that you?" No reply. Just the faint scrape of movement, dragging uneven. The sheriff took 2 steps forward, light sweeping across the floor until it landed on a boot, mud-caked, torn at the seam. A man's leg protruded from behind one of the barrels. Whittaker lunged forward, heart hammering. "Frank, can you hear me?" He rounded the barrel, but what lay there wasn't what he expected. Frank's face was pale, his eyes half open, lips trembling as though he'd been whispering to himself for hours. Around his neck hung a necklace of twine threaded with tiny metal caps, the same red wax seals from the bottles. "Don't drink it," Frank rasped, voice cracking. His gaze flicked toward the crate, then toward the dark slit in the floor. "They fed it." Before Whitaker could ask what he meant, the thudding sound grew louder, so loud it shook the dust from the ceiling. The sheriff grabbed Frank under the arms, trying to lift him, but Frank recoiled, shaking his head violently. "No time," Frank hissed. "Lock it back now." The words were barely out when a deep groan rose from beneath the stone, as though the earth itself was straining against something. A crack snaked outward from the slit in the floor, and a faint glow seeped through, pale and unnatural, pulsing in perfect rhythm with that awful hear. T-beat. Whitaker's grip tightened around Frank's shoulders as the light beneath the cracked floor swelled and dimmed like a breath. Dust rained from the rafters, and the bottles stacked along the cellar wall rattled in unison. Somewhere above, a loose door hinge banged once, then fell eerily silent. "Stay with me, Frank," Whitaker muttered, voice raw with urgency. He tried to drag the man toward the stairs, but Frank dug his heels into the damp stone. "You can't leave it open," Frank gasped. "That door, they locked it for a reason." His trembling hand pointed toward the iron-banded hatch Whitaker had found ajar earlier. The sheriff glanced at it, heart pounding. It didn't look special, just heavy wood scarred by age. But the way Frank stared at it, like it was the only thing holding the world together, made him pause. The sheriff shifted his flashlight toward the slit in the floor. The glow wasn't steady anymore. It was strobing faster, and the thudding beneath his boots had changed, less like a heartbeat now, more like fists pounding from below. Something wet hissed up through the crack. A sour, metallic smell spread through the cellar, making Whitaker gag. He yanked his bandana over his nose and squinted through the haze. The edge of the opening was widening, tiny flakes of stone crumbling inward. "Frank, we're closing that hatch now," Whitaker barked, dragging the man toward it. "No," Frank wheezed, shaking his head wildly. "You have to nail it, seal it, don't just shut it. If it opens again." The floor shuddered violently, cutting him off. One of the barrels toppled, crashing open to spill rotten grain across the floor. Something small and pale tumbled out with it. Whitaker didn't look closely enough to tell if it was bone. He bit back a curse and shoved Frank toward the hatch. The heavy door resisted at first, like it didn't want to move, then suddenly gave way with a groan that echoed through the cellar. The light beneath the floor surged, blinding white for a heartbeat, then sank to a faint, sickly glow. Whitaker slammed the hatch down hard. "Hold it." Frank shouted, voice breaking. Whitaker braced his shoulder against the hatch as if it were pushing back. With his free hand, he grabbed a rusted length of pipe from the floor and jammed it through the handle, twisting until the warped metal locked it in place. The pounding underfoot slowed, dulled, then faded to a distant hum. Frank collapsed to the ground, chest heaving. "You shouldn't have come here, Sheriff." His eyes glistened with something like terror or regret. "They didn't just brew beer down here." Whitaker wiped the sweat from his brow, the cellar now eerily still. "Then what the hell did they brew?" he asked, voice low. Frank swallowed hard, gaze fixed on the sealed hatch. "Not beer, something alive." Sheriff Whitaker didn't speak as he guided Frank up the cellar steps, each creak of the old wood echoing like a warning. Outside, the night air felt heavier than before, thick with the smell of rain and rust. The brewery loomed behind them, silent now but not at rest. Whitaker glanced back once just to be sure and caught the faintest flicker of light in a window that should have been empty. Frank steadied himself against the patrol car, his face pale under the flashing red and blue lights. "You think that'll hold it?" he asked, voice trembling. Whitaker didn't answer right away. He lit a cigarette, the flare of the match briefly illuminating his weary eyes. "It has to," he finally muttered, "but something tells me this place isn't done with us." A low rumble of thunder rolled across the hills as he looked out over the darkened street, wondering how many others in town had heard or felt that scent. Range pounding beneath the earth. If the hatch opened once, what would stop it from opening again, and if it did, who would be there to close it? The sheriff crushed his cigarette under his boot and turned to the camera crew still lingering nearby, their gear humming softly. "Places like this don't stay buried forever," he said, his voice steady but grim. "If you're watching this, remember it. Don't go poking around locked doors and don't assume an empty building is truly empty." He paused, glancing back at the brewery one last time. "If you want to know what's really hiding in the forgotten corners of our towns, stick with us. We've got more places to go. And they're not getting any friendlier." The screen lingered on the dark silhouette of the brewery, a single drop of water sliding down the cellar doorframe as though the building itself was sweating. Then the shot faded to black, leaving only Whitaker's final words echoing, "Like, share and follow. Trust me, you don't want to miss where we're heading next."